Picture this: a couple who spent 40 years building their dream, sacrificing weekends, missing vacations, pouring every ounce of energy into creating a legacy. Finally, retirement arrives. The house is paid off. The children are grown. The grandchildren are healthy and thriving. For the first time in 4 decades, there is nothing but open road ahead and endless possibilities stretching toward the horizon. Now picture that couple vanishing without a trace, their dream retirement lasting exactly 11 days before something sinister swallowed them whole. That is the story of Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, and what happened to them on a dusty Arizona highway in the summer of 1980 would remain a mystery for 43 years. Until now. Until an arrest that would shake an entire community to its core, exposing a betrayal so profound that those who knew the truth would question everything they thought they understood about trust, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the most familiar smiles. If you are watching this and you have ever trusted someone completely, believed in them without question, I need you to pay close attention, because this story will make you reconsider everything. Before we go further, I need you to do something important. Share this video with someone who believes that evil always looks like evil, that monsters are easy to spot. They need to hear this story. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that victims deserve to have their stories told and their killers exposed. Hit that notification bell because the truth I am about to reveal will stay with you long after this video ends. Richard Whitmore was born in 1922 in a small farming community in Ohio. He grew up during the Great Depression, watching his father lose everything and slowly rebuild through sheer determination and backbreaking work. Those early years shaped Richard into the man he would become, someone who understood the value of a dollar, who never took prosperity for granted, who believed that hard work could overcome any obstacle. He served in World War II, surviving the beaches of Normandy and returning home with a Purple Heart and a determination to build a life worthy of the sacrifices he had witnessed. Eleanor was born in 1925, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She was brilliant and beautiful, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. She met Richard at a church social in 1947, and by all accounts, it was love at first sight. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by family and a few close friends. Their honeymoon was a weekend at a lake cabin borrowed from Richard's uncle. They could not afford anything more, but Eleanor would later say those 2 days were the happiest of her life. Together, Richard and Eleanor built Whitmore Construction, a company that started with Richard and a single pickup truck and grew into one of the largest construction firms in the Phoenix metropolitan area. They moved to Arizona in 1955, drawn by the booming post-war economy and the promise of opportunity in the desert. Richard worked 18-hour days while Eleanor managed the books, raised their 3 children, and somehow kept the household running smoothly despite chronic exhaustion and limited resources. By 1975, Whitmore Construction employed over 200 people and had built shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments across the state. The Whitmores were wealthy by any standard, but they never lost touch with their humble origins. They drove practical cars long after they could afford luxury vehicles. They lived in the same modest house they had purchased in 1958, even as their net worth climbed into the millions. They donated generously to charity, particularly causes supporting veterans and underprivileged children. They were beloved in their community, known for their kindness, their integrity, and their unwavering commitment to each other. In 1979, Richard turned 57 and made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced his retirement from Whitmore Construction, handing the reins to his eldest son, David, who had been groomed for leadership since graduating from business school a decade earlier. Richard told friends and family that he had spent 40 years building something for others and now wanted to spend whatever time he had left enjoying life with Eleanor. They had missed so much while working, vacations postponed, adventures delayed, dreams deferred. Now they would finally live. Their plan was simple but ambitious. They would spend the summer of 1980 driving across America in a brand new Winnebago recreational vehicle, visiting national parks, seeing old friends, and rediscovering the country they had been too busy to explore. They departed Phoenix on June 15, 1980, with a meticulously planned itinerary, a cooler full of Eleanor's homemade sandwiches, and hearts full of anticipation. Their 3 children, David, Margaret, and Thomas, waved goodbye from the driveway, promising to hold down the fort until their parents returned in September. Richard and Eleanor never came home. 11 days into their journey, on June 26, 1980, they vanished somewhere along a remote stretch of highway in northern Arizona. Their Winnebago was found abandoned 3 days later, parked at a scenic overlook with no signs of struggle, no signs of foul play, no signs of anything except 2 people who had simply ceased to exist. The keys were in the ignition. Eleanor's purse was on the passenger seat. Richard's wallet, containing over $300 in cash and several credit cards, was in the glove compartment. Nothing was missing except Richard and Eleanor themselves. The disappearance made national news. A wealthy retired couple, beloved community members, vanishing without explanation on what should have been the trip of a lifetime. Theories proliferated. Perhaps they had been abducted by a passing motorist. Perhaps they had wandered into the wilderness and become lost. Perhaps they had staged their own disappearance, though no one who knew them believed that for a moment. Search parties combed the surrounding desert for weeks, finding nothing. Private investigators hired by the family followed leads that went nowhere. Psychics offered visions that proved false. The case grew cold, then frozen, then forgotten by everyone except those who loved Richard and Eleanor. For 43 years, the Whitmore children lived with the agony of not knowing. And then, in 2023, a phone call changed everything. Losing a parent is one of life's most profound experiences. It is painful but expected, a natural part of the human journey that most of us will face eventually. But losing both parents simultaneously, without explanation, without closure, without even the certainty of death, that is something else entirely. That is a wound that never heals, a question that echoes endlessly in the silence of sleepless nights. The Whitmore children, David, Margaret, and Thomas, lived with that wound for over 4 decades, and it shaped each of them in different ways. David Whitmore was 32 years old when his parents disappeared. He had just taken over leadership of Whitmore Construction, a responsibility he had prepared for his entire adult life. But nothing could have prepared him for assuming that role under these circumstances. In the weeks following his parents' disappearance, David found himself simultaneously running a major construction company, coordinating search efforts, managing media inquiries, and trying to hold his family together. He barely slept. He barely ate. He operated on pure adrenaline and determination, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that his parents might be gone forever. As months turned into years without answers, David channeled his grief into work. He expanded Whitmore Construction aggressively, taking on projects his father would have considered too risky, pushing into new markets, driving his employees relentlessly. Some said he was trying to outrun his pain. Others said he was trying to prove something to the father who would never see his achievements. Whatever the motivation, the result was impressive. By 1990, Whitmore Construction had tripled in size and become one of the most successful firms in the Southwest. But success came at a cost. David's first marriage ended in divorce in 1985, his wife citing emotional unavailability and obsessive work habits. His second marriage lasted longer, but was marked by distance and unresolved tension. His relationships with his own children were strained, a painful irony for a man who had enjoyed such a close bond with his own parents. David threw himself into finding answers about Richard and Eleanor, hiring private investigators, following every lead, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a search that never yielded results. He kept a box in his office containing every document related to the case, every theory, every dead end. He reviewed it regularly, looking for something everyone had missed. Margaret Whitmore was 28 when her parents vanished. She was the middle child, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept the family connected. She had been especially close to her mother, speaking with Eleanor by phone almost daily even after marriage and motherhood. The loss of that connection devastated her in ways she struggled to articulate. She found herself picking up the phone to call her mother, forgetting momentarily that there was no one to answer. She would see something beautiful or funny and think about sharing it with Eleanor, only to be crushed anew by the realization of her absence. Margaret dealt with her grief through faith. She became deeply involved in her church, finding comfort in prayer and community. She raised her 4 children with the values her parents had instilled in her, telling them stories about the grandparents they would never know. She kept Eleanor's recipes, cooking her mother's dishes for holidays and special occasions, tears sometimes falling into the mixing bowls as memories overwhelmed her. She maintained hope longer than anyone else in the family, insisting that her parents might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia, perhaps held against their will. It was a hope that sustained her, but also prevented her from fully grieving. Thomas Whitmore was the youngest at 24 when his parents disappeared. He had always been the rebel of the family, the one who questioned expectations and resisted the path laid out for him. He had no interest in joining Whitmore Construction, instead pursuing a career in journalism that took him far from Phoenix and the shadow of his family's success. His relationship with Richard had been complicated, marked by arguments about his life choices and long periods of strained silence. When his parents vanished, Thomas was consumed by regret for things left unsaid, apologies never offered, reconciliations never achieved. Thomas threw himself into investigating his parents' disappearance with the same tenacity he brought to his journalism career. He tracked down witnesses, interviewed law enforcement officials, and wrote extensively about the case, hoping that publicity might generate leads. His articles appeared in newspapers and magazines across the country, keeping the Whitmore case in the public consciousness long after other media had moved on. But years of investigation yielded nothing but frustration. Thomas developed a drinking problem in his 40s, his marriage fell apart, and he spent years estranged from his siblings before finally getting sober and rebuilding those relationships. The 3 Whitmore children gathered every year on June 26th, the anniversary of their parents' disappearance. They would meet at the scenic overlook where the Winnebago had been found, sharing memories and renewing their commitment to finding answers. As they aged, these gatherings became more poignant. David's hair turned gray, then white. Margaret developed arthritis that made the drive difficult. Thomas walked with a cane after a car accident in his 60s. But still they came, year after year, refusing to give up on the parents who had given them everything. Here is something I want you to think about. Imagine carrying a burden like this for 43 years. Imagine waking up every morning with a question that has no answer, going to sleep every night with a mystery that refuses to be solved. Could you maintain hope that long? Could you keep searching when everyone else had given up? Drop a comment below and tell me honestly how long you think you could hold on before accepting that some questions simply have no answers. I believe your response reveals something profound about human resilience and the power of love. The breakthrough came in 2022, not through any effort of the Whitmore children, but through an unexpected source. A construction crew working on a highway expansion project in northern Arizona unearthed something that would finally answer the question the family had been asking for over 4 decades. The construction worker who made the discovery was named Miguel Santos, a 43-year-old father of 3 who had been working road crews for over 2 decades. He had seen plenty of unusual things during his career, artifacts from Native American settlements, old mining equipment, even the occasional buried car from decades-old accidents. But nothing prepared him for what his excavator uncovered on the morning of October 17, 2022. The project was a routine highway expansion, widening a stretch of road that had become congested as northern Arizona's population grew. The area was remote but not desolate, surrounded by scrubland and low hills that turned golden in the autumn light. Miguel's crew had been working the site for 3 weeks, moving earth and preparing the roadbed for new pavement. It was monotonous work, the kind that allowed the mind to wander while the body performed tasks it could do almost automatically. Miguel was operating the excavator that morning, scooping up loads of dirt and depositing them into waiting trucks. He was thinking about his daughter's upcoming quinceañera, mentally calculating costs and guest lists, when his bucket struck something solid. This was not unusual. The Arizona desert was full of rocks and buried debris, but something about the resistance felt different. He backed up the excavator and climbed down to investigate. What he found made his blood run cold. Protruding from the disturbed earth was what appeared to be a human hand, skeletal and weathered but unmistakably human. Miguel stepped back, his heart pounding, and called for his supervisor. Within the hour, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene, with police tape cordoning off an area that would soon reveal secrets buried for over 4 decades. Forensic archaeologists were called in to carefully excavate the site, treating it with the same meticulous attention they would give to any archaeological dig. What they uncovered over the following days was a nightmare made real. 2 bodies, a male and a female, buried together in a shallow grave approximately 6 feet beneath the surface. The bodies had been wrapped in what appeared to be canvas tarps, degraded by time, but still partially intact. Near the bodies, investigators found personal effects, a man's watch, a woman's wedding ring, and most significantly, identification documents that had somehow survived decades of burial. The identification confirmed what investigators had immediately suspected. The bodies belonged to Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, the wealthy retired couple who had vanished on their road trip 43 years earlier. The mystery of their disappearance had finally been solved, but a new mystery had taken its place. Who had killed them and why? Detective Carlos Mendez of the Arizona Department of Public Safety was assigned to lead the investigation. He was a veteran officer with 30 years of experience, including a decade working cold cases. He had seen his share of long-delayed justice, but the Whitmore case presented unique challenges. Most of the original investigators were dead or retired. Witnesses had scattered or passed away. Evidence had degraded beyond usefulness. And whoever had killed the Whitmores had successfully hidden their crime for over 4 decades, suggesting a level of planning and patience that was deeply troubling. The forensic evidence, while limited, told a grim story. Both Richard and Eleanor had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The attacks appeared to have come from behind, suggesting the victims had been ambushed, caught unaware by someone they trusted enough to turn their backs on. There was no evidence of robbery. The personal effects found with the bodies including Eleanor's diamond engagement ring and Richard's expensive watch. This was not a crime of opportunity or financial gain. This was something else entirely. Detective Mendez began by reviewing the original case files from 1980. The investigation at the time had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Investigators had interviewed dozens of people, including family members, business associates, and everyone who had contact with the Whitmores in the days before their disappearance. They had followed leads across multiple states, chasing reported sightings that all proved false. They had considered various theories, from random violence to kidnapping for ransom to voluntary disappearance. None had led anywhere. But Detective Mendez noticed something in the old files that gave him pause. Several interviews mentioned tension within the Whitmore family, specifically regarding the transition of leadership at Whitmore Construction. David Whitmore had assumed control of the company, but some employees had questioned whether this was truly what Richard wanted. There were whispers about disagreements, about Richard having second thoughts about retirement, about conflicts that had been carefully hidden from public view. The detective decided to start his investigation where most homicide investigations begin, with the family. Statistically, murder victims are most likely to be killed by someone they know, someone close to them. And in cases where wealthy individuals are killed, the motive is often financial. Detective Mendez did not want to believe that the Whitmore children, now elderly themselves, could be involved in their parents' deaths. But he had learned long ago that the truth rarely aligns with what we want to believe. He requested financial records from 1980, tracing the flow of money in the months following the Whitmores' disappearance. What he discovered would begin to unravel a web of deception that had remained hidden for over 4 decades. The Whitmore family had always presented a united front to the outside world. They were the picture of American success, a patriarch who built an empire from nothing, a devoted wife who stood beside him through every challenge, children who respected their parents and carried on their legacy. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, tensions simmered that only those closest to the family could see. Detective Mendez began his interviews with David Whitmore, now 75 years old and still serving as chairman of the board at Whitmore Construction, though he had long since handed day-to-day operations to the next generation. David received the detective in his office, a corner suite in a downtown Phoenix high-rise that offered panoramic views of the city his family had helped build. He was frail but sharp-eyed, his white hair carefully combed, his suit impeccably tailored. The conversation started with expressions of relief that his parents had finally been found, that they could be properly buried, that the family could have closure. David's emotions seemed genuine, his eyes misting as he spoke about the decades of wandering, the anniversaries spent at the overlook where the Winnebago was found, the gradual acceptance that he would die without ever knowing what happened. But as Detective Mendez steered the conversation toward the past, toward the dynamics of the family in 1980, David's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. Yes, he admitted, there had been some tension around his father's retirement. Richard Whitmore was not a man who let go of things easily. He had built Whitmore Construction from scratch, had made every important decision for decades, and found it difficult to step back and let his son take the reins. There were disagreements about the direction of the company, about projects David wanted to pursue that Richard considered too risky. But these were normal generational conflicts, David insisted, the kind of friction that occurs in any family business. They had never threatened the fundamental love and respect between father and son. Detective Mendez pressed harder. He had obtained records showing that in the months before his parents' disappearance, David had taken out a substantial loan using his shares in Whitmore Construction as collateral. The loan was for $2 million, an enormous sum in 1980. When asked about this, David's face tightened. It was a business investment, he explained, an opportunity to acquire a competing firm that had fallen on hard times. The deal ultimately fell through, and the loan was repaid within a year from company profits. There was nothing suspicious about it. But when Detective Mendez asked whether Richard had known about the loan, David hesitated for just a moment before admitting that no, he had not told his father. Richard would have opposed the acquisition, would have seen it as overreach. David had planned to present it as a fait accompli once the deal was complete. But the deal never completed. Because 11 days into their retirement road trip, Richard and Eleanor Whitmore vanished. The interview with Margaret Whitmore was less contentious but equally illuminating. Margaret, now 71, lived in the same house she had occupied for 40 years, surrounded by photographs of her parents and the family they had built. She spoke warmly about Richard and Eleanor, about their devotion to each other and their children, about the example they had set for how a marriage should work. But when asked about her brothers, Margaret's warmth cooled noticeably. She admitted that there had always been competition between David and Thomas, the responsible eldest son versus the rebellious youngest. David had been their father's clear favorite, groomed for leadership from an early age, while Thomas had been something of a disappointment, never living up to the family's expectations. And yes, she acknowledged, Thomas had argued bitterly with Richard in the weeks before the road trip. Thomas had asked for money to start a magazine, and Richard had refused, telling his youngest son that he needed to prove himself before expecting family support. The argument had been ugly, Margaret recalled. Thomas had accused Richard of playing favorites, of always supporting David while dismissing him. Richard had responded that Thomas had never shown the discipline or commitment that David demonstrated daily. Words were exchanged that could never be taken back. Thomas stormed out of the family home and did not attend the farewell gathering when Richard and Eleanor departed for their trip. Thomas Whitmore, now 67, agreed to meet Detective Mendez at a coffee shop near his apartment in Tucson. He walked with a cane, the result of a car accident years earlier, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had lived hard and survived harder. He was immediately defensive when the detective brought up the argument with his father. Yes, he had fought with Richard. Yes, he had said things he regretted. But to suggest that he had anything to do with his parents' deaths was obscene. He had spent decades trying to find out what happened to them, had written countless articles, had pursued leads that everyone else had abandoned. Would a guilty man do that? Would someone who had murdered his own parents dedicate his life to seeking justice for them? Detective Mendez noted that Thomas's journalism career had brought him considerable recognition and opportunities. The Whitmore case had been his signature story, the foundation on which he had built his reputation. A cynic might suggest that keeping the case unsolved while appearing to seek resolution was the perfect cover for someone with something to hide. Thomas's face reddened with anger. He demanded to know whether he was being accused of something. Detective Mendez calmly explained that he was simply following the evidence wherever it led, as any good investigator must. But he could not ignore the fact that Thomas had motive, opportunity, and a documented conflict with the victims shortly before their disappearance. The interview ended with Thomas ordering the detective to leave and threatening to contact his lawyer. But as Detective Mendez walked away, he noticed something that troubled him. Thomas's hands were shaking, and not just from anger. The investigation into the Whitmore murders was entering its third month when Detective Mendez received information that would redirect everything. A retired police officer named Frank Morrison, who had worked the original case in 1980, had heard about the discovery of the bodies and wanted to talk. He was 87 years old and in poor health, living in a nursing home in Prescott, but his mind remained sharp, and he had something he needed to get off his chest before he died. Detective Mendez drove to Prescott on a gray November morning, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The nursing home was a modest facility, clean but worn, filled with the quiet hum of elderly lives winding down. Frank Morrison was waiting for him in a small private room, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket across his knees. His eyes, though surrounded by wrinkled skin and heavy lids, were alert and intense. "I've been carrying this for over 40 years, Frank said without preamble. "I knew something was wrong back then, but I couldn't prove it. And by the time I might have been able to, too many years had passed. I told myself it was too late, that there was no point in dredging up old suspicions. But now you found them. Now there's a chance for justice. I can't die without telling you what I know." What Frank knew was this. In the summer of 1980, while the search for the Whitmores was still active, he had received an anonymous tip. A caller, their voice disguised, claimed to have information about the disappearance. They said that the answer was closer to home than anyone realized, that someone in the Whitmore inner circle knew exactly what had happened. The caller promised to provide evidence, but never called back. Frank had taken the tip seriously, beginning a quiet investigation into the Whitmore family and their associates. He had discovered something troubling. A man named Gerald Thornton, who served as the Whitmore family's personal attorney and financial advisor, had made some unusual transactions in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. Large sums of money had moved through accounts he controlled, and some of those sums had ended up in places they should not have been. But before Frank could pursue the lead further, he was removed from the case. His superiors cited budget constraints and the need to focus resources on more solvable crimes. Frank had protested but was overruled. He was transferred to a different department and eventually retired in 1985, taking his suspicions with him. Over the years, he had tried to convince himself that he was wrong, that Gerald Thornton was an upstanding professional who would never be involved in something so terrible. But he had never quite believed it. Gerald Thornton. Detective Mendez recognized the name from the original case files. He had been interviewed briefly in 1980 and had provided a solid alibi for the time of the disappearance. He was vacationing in Europe with his wife, a trip documented by hotel receipts and passport stamps. But alibis could be manufactured, and physical presence at a murder scene was not strictly necessary for someone to be responsible for that murder. Detective Mendez returned to Phoenix and began investigating Gerald Thornton. What he discovered painted a portrait of a man very different from the respectable attorney the public had known. Gerald had died in 2005 at the age of 78, so he could not be interviewed. But his widow, Helen Thornton, was still alive at 91, living in an assisted living facility in Scottsdale. Helen Thornton was reluctant to speak with police. She was protective of her late husband's memory and initially insisted that Gerald had been a good man who would never harm anyone. But as Detective Mendez gently pressed, showing her evidence of financial irregularities that implicated Gerald in embezzlement from multiple clients, including the Whitmores, her resistance began to crumble. Gerald had not been a good man, Helen finally admitted. He had been controlling and occasionally cruel. He had secrets she had never understood, late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, money that appeared and disappeared without explanation. She had learned early in their marriage not to ask questions. But there was one thing she knew that she had never told anyone. In the weeks before the Whitmores disappeared, Gerald had been unusually agitated. He had mentioned something about Richard Whitmore discovering problems with the accounts, about an audit that could expose everything. The picture was becoming clearer. Gerald Thornton had been embezzling from the Whitmores, possibly for years. Richard, preparing for retirement and wanting to ensure his affairs were in order, had discovered the theft. If Richard exposed Gerald, the attorney would face prison and the destruction of everything he had built. Gerald needed Richard silenced, and Eleanor as well, since she was equally aware of the family finances. But Gerald Thornton was dead. He had escaped earthly justice by dying before his crimes could be exposed. Case closed? Not quite. Because Detective Mendez had learned something else during his investigation, something that suggested Gerald had not acted alone. In 1980, Gerald Thornton had a junior partner in his law firm, a young, ambitious attorney who had been brought in to handle the growing workload as the practice expanded. That junior partner had eventually taken over the firm when Gerald retired in 1992. His name was Harrison Webb, and at 74 years old, he was still practicing law in Phoenix. Harrison Webb had built a sterling reputation over his 5-decade legal career. He was known for his philanthropy, his mentorship of young attorneys, and his active involvement in community organizations. He served on the boards of 3 charities and had been honored multiple times for his pro bono work representing low-income families. His office was decorated with plaques and awards, photographs of him shaking hands with governors and senators, testaments to a life of service and achievement. None of it was real. Detective Mendez obtained a warrant to examine Gerald Thornton's old case files, which had been archived when the firm changed hands. What he found in those dusty boxes was damning. Detailed records of embezzlement from multiple clients, spanning decades. Evidence that young Harrison Webb had not merely been aware of Gerald's crimes, but had been an active participant, handling the money transfers and maintaining the false accounting that kept the scheme hidden. More disturbing still, Detective Mendez found a file labeled simply RW. Inside were handwritten notes in Gerald Thornton's handwriting, discussing the problem of Richard Whitmore's discovery, the need for a permanent solution, and the involvement of H in making arrangements. There were references to a location in northern Arizona, map coordinates that matched the site where the bodies had been found. And there was a receipt from a hardware store dated June 24, 1980, 2 days before the Whitmores disappeared, for canvas tarps, rope, and a shovel. The receipt was signed by Harrison Webb. The evidence was overwhelming. Gerald Thornton had orchestrated the murders, but Harrison Webb had been his instrument. While Gerald was establishing his alibi in Europe, Harrison had traveled to northern Arizona, intercepted the Whitmores at a predetermined location, killed them, and buried their bodies in a grave he had prepared in advance. For 43 years, he had walked free, built a successful career, been celebrated as a pillar of the community, all while carrying the blood of 2 innocent people on his hands. Detective Mendez brought his findings to the district attorney, who agreed that the evidence was sufficient for an arrest. On the morning of March 15, 2023, Harrison Webb was taken into custody at his home in Paradise Valley. He was handcuffed in front of his wife and adult children, who watched in stunned disbelief as the man they knew as a loving husband and father was led away by police. The news of Harrison Webb's arrest exploded across the media. A respected attorney, a community leader, accused of double murder in a case that had captivated the nation over 4 decades earlier. The Whitmore children, now elderly themselves, gathered at David's home to watch the press conference together. Carlos, Margaret, and Thomas sat in silence as the district attorney described the evidence against Harrison Webb, explaining how their parents had died and who was responsible. Margaret wept quietly, her worst fears confirmed. David sat rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. And Thomas, who had spent decades investigating his parents' disappearance, felt a strange mixture of vindication and devastation. He had always believed the answer was close to home, had always suspected someone the family trusted, but he had never imagined this. The trial of Harrison Webb began in September 2023 and lasted 3 weeks. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Gerald Thornton had committed the murders alone and had framed his young partner. But the evidence was too comprehensive, the documentation too detailed, the timeline too precise. Harrison Webb had purchased the supplies. Harrison Webb had been seen in northern Arizona in the days before the disappearance. And Harrison Webb had benefited handsomely from the continued embezzlement scheme after the Whitmores were eliminated, receiving payments from Gerald Thornton for years that could only be explained as compensation for services rendered. The most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Harrison Webb's own daughter, Catherine, took the stand as a prosecution witness. She testified that in 2019, during a health scare that had led her father to believe he was dying, he had confessed to her. He had told her about the Whitmores, about the murder, about the decades of secrecy. He had begged for her forgiveness, had explained that he had been young and desperate and under Gerald's control. But Catherine had been unable to forgive. She had lived with the knowledge of her father's crime for 4 years, wrestling with whether to come forward, before finally deciding that justice mattered more than family loyalty. Harrison Webb sat stone-faced as his daughter's words condemned him. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that the decades Webb had spent as a free man made the punishment, in some ways, inadequate. "You stole over 40 years from your victims and their family," the judge said. "You lived a life of comfort and acclaim while they rotted in an unmarked grave. Nothing this court can do will restore what was taken, but we can ensure that your remaining years are spent contemplating the enormity of your crimes." The conviction of Harrison Webb brought a wave of emotions that crashed over the Whitmore family with overwhelming force. For 43 years, they had lived in a limbo of uncertainty, not knowing what had happened to their parents, not knowing whether they had suffered, not knowing who was responsible. Now they knew everything, and the knowledge was almost too much to bear. David Whitmore, the eldest, who had carried the weight of the family business and the family's search for answers for over 4 decades, finally allowed himself to break down. In the privacy of his home, with only his wife beside him, he wept like he had not wept since he was a child. He wept for his parents, stolen from him just as they were about to enjoy the retirement they had earned. He wept for his own lost years, the marriages that had failed, the relationships with his children that had suffered, all because part of him had always been searching, always wondering, never fully present. And he wept with relief that it was finally over, that the question that had haunted him since he was 32 years old had finally been answered. Margaret Whitmore found unexpected peace in the resolution. Her faith, which had sustained her through the darkest years, now gave her a framework for understanding and forgiveness. She visited Harrison Webb in prison, not to offer absolution, but to tell him about the parents he had killed. She spoke for 2 hours, describing Richard and Eleanor's love, their kindness, their hopes for their golden years. She wanted Harrison to understand that he had not merely ended 2 lives, but had rippled destruction through generations, affecting children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had never known the grandparents they should have had. Harrison listened in silence, and Margaret left without expecting or receiving any response. The visit was not for him. It was for her, a way of speaking to her parents one last time through the man who had taken them. Thomas Whitmore faced perhaps the most complicated emotional journey. He had spent his career investigating his parents' disappearance, and in some ways, his identity was bound up in the search. Now that the search was over, he was not sure who he was anymore. he decided to write one final piece about the Whitmore case, a comprehensive account that would tell the complete story from beginning to end. It would be his tribute to his parents and his way of closing a chapter that had defined his life. The book was published in 2024 to critical acclaim. It told not only the story of Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, but also the story of their children, of the decades of waiting and wondering, of the detective who had finally solved the case, and of the killer who had hidden in plain sight for over 40 years. Thomas dedicated the book to his parents and to his siblings, and the final chapter was a meditation on justice, time, and the enduring power of family bonds. The Whitmore family held a private funeral for Richard and Eleanor in the spring of 2024. The bodies were finally laid to rest in a cemetery plot that had been purchased and kept empty for over 4 decades, waiting for the day when the missing would be found. David, Margaret, and Thomas stood together at the graveside, their own children and grandchildren surrounding them, as a priest offered prayers for the departed. David spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. "Dad, Mom, we never stopped looking for you. We never stopped believing that someday we would bring you home. It took 43 years, but we did it. You can rest now. And so can we." Margaret read from the Book of Psalms, Eleanor's favorite, her voice breaking on the familiar words that her mother had loved. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." She thought of her mother's faith, of the candles Eleanor had lit each Sunday, of the prayers she had offered for her family. She hoped her mother could hear these words now, wherever she was. Thomas spoke last, and his words were the most personal. "I spent my whole life trying to make you proud, Dad. We fought, and I said things I regretted, and I never got to apologize before you were taken. So I'm apologizing now. I'm sorry for the anger, for the rebellion, for the years I wasted trying to prove I didn't need your approval when I wanted it more than anything. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you know that everything I did after you were gone, all the searching and the writing and the fighting for justice, that was my way of showing you that I was worthy of being your son." The 3 siblings embraced as the coffins were lowered into the ground. For the first time in 43 years, the Whitmore family was complete again, not in life, but in the peace of knowing that the people they loved were finally at rest. 5 years have passed since Harrison Webb's conviction. The case that had haunted the Whitmore family for over 4 decades is now closed, but its echoes continue to ripple through their lives and through the broader community that watched their story unfold. David Whitmore retired from his position as chairman of Whitmore Construction shortly after the trial, handing the reins to his grandson, who represents the 4th generation of Whitmores in the business. Freed from the weight he had carried for so long, David has dedicated his remaining years to rebuilding relationships with his children and grandchildren. He speaks openly about the mistakes he made, the ways in which his obsession with finding his parents had prevented him from being fully present for his own family. His children, now middle-aged themselves, have embraced his efforts at reconciliation. Sunday dinners at David's home have become a tradition, filled with laughter and stories and the warmth that was too often missing during the dark years. Margaret Whitmore continues her work with the church, but she has expanded her ministry to include support for families of missing persons. She founded the Richard and Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, which provides resources and counseling to families navigating the particular agony of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. The foundation has helped hundreds of families over the past 5 years, offering both practical support and the understanding that comes from someone who has walked the same path. Margaret says her parents would be proud of this legacy, that their tragedy has been transformed into something that helps others. Thomas Whitmore's book became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary that aired on a major streaming platform. He has used his platform to advocate for improved resources for cold case investigations, testifying before Congress about the importance of genetic genealogy and other modern techniques that can solve crimes once thought unsolvable. He reconciled fully with his siblings, and the 3 of them are closer now than they have been since childhood. Thomas says losing his parents taught him the value of family, and he refuses to waste another day taking those relationships for granted. Detective Carlos Mendez retired from the Arizona Department of Public Safety following the Webb conviction, his career capped by the resolution of a case that had seemed impossible to solve. He received numerous awards and recognition for his work, but he says the greatest reward was seeing the Whitmore children finally get the answers they deserved. He stays in touch with the family, attending their annual memorial gathering and sharing meals with people he has come to consider friends. Harrison Webb remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. His wife divorced him following the conviction, and his son has changed his name and moved across the country, seeking to escape the shadow of his father's crimes. Only his daughter Catherine maintains contact, visiting him occasionally, driven by a complicated mixture of love and revulsion that she continues to work through with a therapist. Harrison has reportedly expressed remorse for his actions, though many question the sincerity of a man who hid his crimes for over 4 decades. Whether his remorse is genuine or merely strategic is ultimately irrelevant. Justice has been served, and that is what matters. The Whitmore case has become a landmark in the history of cold case investigations, demonstrating that no crime is truly unsolvable if the right technology and the right determination are brought to bear. Law enforcement agencies across the country have cited the case as inspiration for reopening their own cold cases, and several have achieved similar breakthroughs using the techniques pioneered in the Whitmore investigation. But beyond its significance to criminal justice, the Whitmore case is ultimately a story about love. The love of parents for their children, expressed through decades of sacrifice and hard work. The love of children for their parents, expressed through decades of searching and refusing to give up. And the love that endures beyond death, beyond time, beyond all the darkness that the world can throw against it. Richard and Eleanor Whitmore never got to complete their road trip. They never got to see the national parks they had planned to visit, never got to reconnect with the old friends on their itinerary, never got to discover what their retirement years might have held. Their golden years were stolen from them by greed and violence, and a betrayal of trust that defies comprehension. But their legacy lives on. In the company they built, now thriving under the 4th generation of Whitmore leadership. In the foundation that bears their name, helping families find closure and healing. In the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who carry their values and their memories forward into the future. And in the story itself, told and retold, reminding us all that evil may win battles, but love wins wars, that justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way into the light. The highway where Richard and Eleanor Whitmore began their final journey still stretches across northern Arizona, carrying travelers toward destinations of their own. Most of them will never know about the couple who vanished here over 4 decades ago, or about the grave that waited beside the road for so long before being discovered. But for those who know the story, the road has taken on a deeper meaning. It is a reminder of loss, but also of love, of tragedy, but also of justice, of darkness, but also of the light that eventually dispels it. Richard and Eleanor Whitmore are home now, and the family they left behind has finally found peace. The case is closed, but the story will never be forgotten. On the anniversary of his parents' funeral, David Whitmore returned to the cemetery with his siblings. The 3 of them stood before the headstone, reading the words engraved in granite, Richard and Eleanor Whitmore. Together in life, together in death, together in eternity. David placed a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite flowers, white roses, on the grave. Margaret added a small prayer card. Thomas left a copy of his book, open to the dedication page. "We did it," David said softly. "We brought you home. We got you justice. And we're going to be okay now." The 3 elderly siblings stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on their faces. Then, arm in arm, they walked away from the grave and toward the rest of their lives, carrying their parents' love with them every step of the way.